Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Before I get to my questions, let me just share with my colleagues in the committee and the witnesses in front of us just one of many examples. The exchange I just witnessed fails to point to any partisan language in the directives that were referenced. If anything, I'll call your attention to the National Voter Registration Act, which was passed on an overwhelming bipartisan basis in 1993. And before we get to the substance of the act, just find under Section 2, findings and purposes, findings that Congress, again on a bipartisan basis, finds that, one, the right of citizens of the United States to vote is a fundamental right. Number two, it is the duty of the federal, state, and local governments to promote the exercise of that right. And it goes on from there. So for anybody looking for where in statute we might find the opening for the federal government, not on a partisan basis, on a nonpartisan basis, to encourage, actually accept a role and responsibility in encouraging citizens of the United States to exercise their fundamental right to vote. Here's one example. Moving on. I know we can and should have longer-term conversations about modernizing elections and what y'all need to continue to protect the integrity of the bedrock of our democracy. I know that threats to election workers and poll workers has already been covered in this hearing, but recognizing that, look, we're well deep into the primary season of 2024, November's on the horizon. Let's talk about some practical here and now things that can and should be done. Just two examples from my home state. At the county level, Santa Clara County, one of the larger counties in my state, hosts an annual media day. Every election has a media day to help inform voters and, the press, and by extension the public, of the voting process. The more understanding there is, the more we can follow the news and maintain faith and confidence in the process. Post-primary, they're now doing the vote counting because it takes a while in California because of the high levels of participation. Statewide, California has implemented a ballot tracking system where people can sign up to receive text messages, email messages in multiple languages, by the way, on the status of their ballot on the way to the voter, on the way back to the county, when it's processed, when it's been counted. Questions for Mr. Kramer. What systems are in place for state and local officials to learn what either federal resources or university resources are available to them, and maybe even a sharing of information systems to share these best practices?
Thank you for the question, Senator. The great honor we have in Charleston County is election sharing with our state partners. We hold a state conference every year. But one thing I'm proud of is we're launching the Voter Ambassador Program in Charleston County, and we are the trusted election information source. And we're going to empower other organizations within Charleston County to be our ambassadors under strict guidelines, but it helps give that official information. So when we do a program like that, we have to be able to share that with other counties and states. The EAC has a great clearinghouse program that we are now being able to tap into, and that is a resource sharing where we can ask questions. What are you doing to be effective in election administration? And it's a tool that I actually applaud the EAC for introducing, and it helps election officials.
Wonderful. Thank you. Now, on a very specific topic, recently the Department of Education clarified rules around the federal work-study program, making it clear that, yes, it is legal for students on work-study jobs to work in election offices. I actually encouraged the department to make this clarification last October because somehow it was a question in the minds of some, and I'm glad it happened. I think it's a terrific way to bring dedicated younger Americans into elections offices to see their democracy up close and personal. And imagine being inspired to pursue a career in that area, but in the short term, possibly help alleviate some staffing concerns. Question for Mr. Kramer. You've previously had high school and college-age poll workers and election workers, correct? How have they performed?
They are amazing, and they bring a fresh breath of air to the polling places. Our lead poll workers love when they see high school students and college students participating. And one of the things we see is then they continue serving after they've done it once. And that's the remarkable thing about bringing young kids into the process. And then in South Carolina, you can serve as young as 16. And they get really conflict resolution. They're able to do team building. So this is a really great resume builder, and I look forward to actually working with the College of Charleston. We have the EAC grant money that we're going to introduce some programming through that, so we're excited.
Secretary Benson, is this something you can adopt or expand on in Michigan?
Well, Senator Padilla, you know we're already doing this in Michigan.
Softball. It's called the softball.
But yes, I mean, I'm grateful for my colleague in South Carolina for his leadership, but truly partnerships and make democracy work, and it's a team sport. So, and we welcome, people of all backgrounds, left, right, and in the middle of serving as election workers. It's a great way to see just how secure our system is.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Ossoff, and then the ever-patient Senator Butler. Senator Ossoff.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Senator Butler. Thank you to the panel. Secretary Benson, former president called Georgia's Secretary of State, and this is in the immediate aftermath of a 2020 election, said, quote, "So look, all I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have." You ever gotten a call from a presidential candidate asking you to find precisely the number of votes they need to win the election?
No, I've never gotten a call from any candidate for any race asking for making such an inappropriate request of an election official.
How about you, Secretary Allen? You ever gotten a call from a candidate asking you to find precisely the number of votes they need to win?
I've not received a telephone call.
Strike you as proper?
Excuse me?
Does it strike you as proper?
No, listen, I can only take care of what we have in Alabama.
Simple question. Does it strike you as proper for the President of the United States to call a state Secretary of State and ask them to find the exact number of votes they need to win the state?
I don't know exactly what he meant by finding those votes, but I was not Secretary at the time.
Secretary Allen, does it strike you as proper for the President of the United States to call a state Secretary of State and ask them to find precisely the number of votes they need to win? Yes or no?
I can tell you that as Secretary in Alabama, I'm going to follow the law that Alabama legislature has laid out for me to follow when administering the elections.
Oh, your fear answering that question doesn't inspire confidence. Let me ask you, Secretary Benson, about the intimidation of election workers. You had noted legislation that I'm introducing this week, the Election Worker and Polling Place Protection Act. It would create criminal penalties for threats of violence to intimidate voters or election officials. Appreciate you expressing support for the legislation. What effects do threats on election workers and efforts to intimidate election workers have on election administration?
I mean, not only does it cause us to fear going to work and feel, even though we do important work and do it with pride, that somehow there are people who wish to harm us, our staff, or our families for simply doing our patriotic duty. But in addition to that, it makes it a lot harder for us to do that duty. It takes us away from the actual work of administering elections every time we need to issue protections or think about our own safety. So I think, and I could say, speaking with our election workers, having a very clear statement in the law that it is not okay, that it is a crime to threaten us in our workplace for simply just doing the job of making elections work for everyone. It's long overdue to see that federal legislation passed, and I can say with experience of passing similar legislation in Michigan, it goes a long way to send a message that type of behavior is not approved or appropriate in our state.
Mr. Kramer, what do you think? What's the impact on election administration when there are threats and intimidation of election workers, which, as we saw in 2020, and we saw in Georgia? In fact, I would note, Madam Chair, the Republican election officials in Georgia were begging in public that the former president cease spreading baseless conspiracy theories about the theft of the election in Georgia because it put lives at risk. What's the impact, Mr. Kramer, on the capacity of election workers to do their jobs when they face those kinds of threats and when those threats are based upon baseless conspiracies about election fraud?
It's keeping the good people still running elections for this country. In South Carolina, we're losing a wealth of knowledge, hardworking professional men and women who serve this country by performing this duty, and they're leaving. And that wealth of knowledge leaving is a bad thing for the United States. These are people who swear to uphold the Constitution of the state and of the United States. So no, it is a bad thing, and it's one thing that I actually, when asked what keeps me up at night, it's the protection of these workers. And when they wake up in the morning and they get a threat to their safety, That concerns me. It should concern everyone.
Thank you, Mr. Kramer. Ms. Nelson, in Georgia, in the aftermath of the 2020 election. By the way, I want to note there's a lengthy op-ed that was written by a guy named Ken Block. He was hired by the Trump campaign to find fraud in Georgia, found none, wrote a lengthy editorial about how he found none and the impact of these conspiracy theories. Nevertheless, on the basis of those conspiracy theories, the Georgia state legislature passed a law that, for example, cuts the available time for runoff elections in half, driving up wait times in runoff elections. What's the impact of that kind of policy on ensuring access to the ballot for all eligible voters?
Well, Georgia passed a very harmful omnibus voter suppression law, and what it does is exacerbates the issues that black voters in particular face, like long lines. We know that Georgia has a very, very horrible reputation for disproportionate lines that black voters face, and we know that part of their law attempted to actually prevent people from providing basic sustenance to those people who have to wait on disproportionately long lines, like water and snacks. We were fortunate enough to be able to beat back part of that law and some of the other aspects of that law that would have disenfranchised many black voters. But good portions of that law still exist, and we know that we have to redouble our efforts in order to have a fair shot at casting a ballot in the upcoming elections.
I believe the research is 6 times longer waiting in line for black voters in Georgia. Thank you, Ms. Nelson. Thank you all for your testimony.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff. Senator Butler.
The gift of being number 100.
I'll remember that time you went first on this
A
committee.
total gift. That's why I said it works in all kinds of ways, and particularly depending on your chair. So definitely appreciate you all for your testimony and for being here. Ms. Nelson, if you wouldn't mind, would love to start with you. You submitted in your written testimony the challenges that the LDF sort of was facing and working with in Hinds County, Mississippi, Jackson. In particular, I think there was some specific data that you shared in that written testimony, saying that Hinds County is approximately 70% black, experienced extensive ballot shortages during the 2023 Mississippi statewide election. Now, this was one of the first times in my recent memory as a Mississippian that there was a competitive governor's race. And there was an opportunity for Mississippi to elect their first Democratic governor in, again, very long time. But your written testimony also noted that there were up to nine polling locations in Hinds County that ran out of ballots multiple times during Election Day, some of them before 12 noon. Mm-hmm. Now, I know that LDF was a part of some investigative work and steps to help to find out in Hinds County what went wrong in efforts to offer those learnings to others, advocacy organizations across the state and across the country and those who are doing that work. Can you just share with the committee quickly what you learned from the investigation of what happened in Hinds County?
Sure. Some of it is still ongoing. And in fact, I mentioned the elections in Mississippi today. And unfortunately, we did not get an answer before today's election as to whether there was any threat of ballots running out again based on what we learned in the previous election. So we're still investigating that. That's why we have people on the ground. And that's why we are documenting in a new report, Democracy Defended, all of the different incursions on the right to vote that we're finding so that there's a record that can support the federal legislation that we're here to demand Congress pass. The suggestion that there are no modern conditions that should give rise to federal intervention is just patently false. And the work that we do along with our civil rights colleagues every election on the ground establishes that record to support federal legislation like the Freedom to Vote Act and the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act.
Thank you, Ms. Nelson. Mr. Allen, I actually had the pleasure of being down in Alabama just a week ago and being on the campus of Alabama State University as a member of this body, conducting a field hearing in Alabama, talking to Alabama voters about just that point, the modern discrimination that Alabamans are experiencing and that we are seeing happen across the country. I would like to actually, instead of landing there, you said something in your testimony just a few minutes ago in response to an earlier question that I would love to just press on just a little bit to understand more. You made mention of some HAVA funds. You said that your office uses to get mapping software for counties and municipalities. Am I capturing that accurately?
It's for the county boards of registrars.
So that's that's really helpful because I noted that just earlier this month there's 6,000 voters in Alabama's newly drawn 2nd congressional district that received election postcards listing incorrect voter information. I appreciate that your office has said before that you weren't involved in sending out those postcards. Can you talk a little bit about the intersection between the challenges of Alabama voters not getting the correct information, the tools that you say that your office helps to provide and facilitate for county elections, and why you think that your office had nothing to do with voters in Alabama getting the incorrect information for their polling location?
Sure, it is the boards of registrars in every county to make sure that the voters are placed in the correct district. It is not the secretary's role or the secretary's office role to conduct any of the voter assignments. That is solely left up to the county. All the Southern Poverty Law Center had to do was to place a phone call to us, and we could have made sure we got on the telephone with the county in question to make sure we got it right. But instead, what they chose to do was to send out a press release at Monday afternoon before the primary, which introduced confusion and introduced chaos right before the primary election. And, it was something that wasn't appreciated by my office. Open communication would have been best for the day to do that, but it was on Montgomery County and those boards of registrars to make sure they had those voters in the correct district and make sure that everyone was in the correct precinct. And everyone that voted on Election Day got the correct ballot. I want everybody to understand that. They got the correct ballot to vote in Congressional District 2.
Thank you, Secretary Allen. I find it interesting, and I know there's another senator waiting. I find it interesting that the response goes to what an advocacy group was doing or not doing, and in Alabama, in SB 1, those very same advocacy groups are prohibited from actually helping people get the information that they need. So I find that an interesting contradiction, but thank you. I yield my time, Chair Moorman.
Okay, Senator Bennett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for holding this hearing, and to all of you, thank you for your willingness to be here today to testify. Secretary Benson, I had a couple questions for you, if that's okay. We heard yesterday on the Intelligence Committee from leaders of the intelligence community the not very surprising news about the continuing threat that social media platforms pose to our democracy. Every single one of these platforms, I think, virtually has been used to spread education-related disinformation, not just here, but all around the world, sometimes to violent and deadly effect. In the lead up to the 2022 elections, online mentions of voter fraud just absolutely skyrocketed. In 2020, we saw our fellow citizens storm the Capitol, which is well known to save an election that had not been stolen. Their rage amplified by relentless algorithms that were engineered really for profit to sell advertising, not for the sake of our democracy. Certainly in 2016, it's well established, this is not a political view, that Vladimir Putin interfered with our election, as he has repeatedly with elections in other countries around the world, here playing both sides of every single issue with 10 million tweets. That's not an exaggeration, to quote Joe Biden. That is the reality of what was happening there. And I think, you know, there's a lot going on, as the chair knows, today on TikTok in the Capitol. I don't want to get distracted by that today, except to say probably good things are not going to happen if one of the sources of major information in terms of our electoral process is coming from a platform that is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. One can imagine that that's going to be end in a bad way for the United States. And I think it would be really self-defeating of us to assume that what happened in 2022 and in 2020 and in 2016 isn't going to happen again this year. You've stated that misinformation is the top concern in 2024, even more than in 2020. Could you talk a little bit about what national standards you think we ought to be able to put in place to help safeguard our elections from online influence campaigns?
Thank you, Senator. And yes, we've been working in Michigan to emphasize that there's a greater incentive than ever before for foreign actors to interfere with our elections, and the mechanism through which they will interfere is through trying to deceive our voters. And particularly with this being the first election in which artificial intelligence is on the rise as an evolving threat, we believe that will be one of the more likely tactics that they utilize, particularly through social media and elsewhere. So I do think first and foremost for the Senate to pass the Senator Klobuchar bill against deceptive practices with AI will be key to helping every state be prepared. We have state legislation. We're one of 6 states that have passed state legislation to that effect. But secondly, I would argue that as I often say, democracy is a team sport, and these statements saying what is okay and what is not, what is illegal and what is not with regards to deception in elections is one piece, but it is not the whole piece of the puzzle. We also have to equip trusted voices, faith leaders, business leaders, community leaders, labor leaders, and many others, which we're doing in our state, and I think we need to do nationwide. And I think every senator could be a convener of these trusted voices to equip them with truthful information about our elections, help us to get that out ahead of the misinformation hitting our states, and that will help us to ensure voters don't get fooled because they've already been educated ahead of time about the truth in our elections and where to get trusted information if they need more.
If I've got 1 minute left, could I ask one more question quickly, Madam Chair? Is that all right? Thank you. Next week, as you know, and the Supreme Court is going to hear the case of Murphy against Missouri, which addresses a district court decision preventing the federal government from communicating with social media companies about the content on their sites. This decision, the lower court decision, has had a disastrous effect on our ability to combat foreign influence operations and protect the integrity of our elections. It affects the government's ability to coordinate with the platforms, on public health information. That threatens to undermine the efforts undertaken across multiple presidential administrations to hold the platforms accountable for their own, to have their own sets of policies. The Washington Post just reported that the federal government has basically stopped warning some platforms about foreign disinformation campaigns altogether as a result of that. And legal experts have called the injunction strikingly broad. They've pointed to flaws in its logic, its confused legal arguments, and the alarming conclusions it draws about the federal government's role to play. I just wonder how you're navigating these challenges in this changing legal environment when it comes to communicating with platforms and the clear and present danger to Michigan's elections.
It's difficult, and certainly the court ruling makes it a lot more challenging to collaborate with social media companies that have an important role to play in protecting their users from deceptive tactics and misinformation. So we'll be eagerly awaiting the outcome of that particular case. But in the interim, working with citizens to help them become critical consumers of the information they do receive, helping them understand the way in which the misinformation causes chaos and confusion and disruption to our elections has been our focus, so that we can empower the citizens in our state to spot the deep fakes, to spot people trying to fool them, to spot the bad information on social media, and not only not send it or forward it, but instead respond with truthful information to help us counter that in every way in our state.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you again to everybody on the panel.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, all our witnesses, for a very good hearing. I'm grateful to the election officials here today and for your work to ensure elections are administered securely and safely. I also want to thank Ms. Nelson for her continued work to ensure equal access on the ballot. And I look forward to continuing our work on this committee to support election officials and protect our free and fair election. The hearing record will remain open for 1 week. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you.